Why are we always talking about edge of breakup tones? If you watch basically any of the guitar YouTube channels out there, you've probably heard this term more than once, especially if you watch my channel. I talk about edge of breakup amp tones seemingly nonstop. But what does it actually mean, and what does it actually sound like? And why would you want to set up an amp for edge of breakup? Why not completely clean, or why not completely distorted? We're gonna talk about that in today's video. I'm gonna tell you what's actually happening inside your amp to cause an edge of breakup tone. I'm gonna show you how to dial in your amp at home to get an edge of breakup tone and why you would want to do that. And I'm even gonna show how to dial in a great edge of breakup sound with a modeler like the Helix. Now, before we jump into the video, if you wanna know more about guitar tone and the ins and outs of great guitar tone, I made an entire video course called the Tone Course, which you can check out in the description box down below. Especially if you're a complete beginner, you're new to the electric guitar and you don't really know where to start and where to find your sound, I'd highly recommend checking out the course. You can also find my other video courses down there, like the Nashville Number System and the Fretboard Fundamentals course, which just came out. That's all linked down below. So in order to understand edge of breakup guitar tones, we need to start at the source, not just the guitar amp, but the crucial part of the guitar amp, which is responsible for that distortion, which is the tube. So before we start talking about edge of breakup tones and how to get them, I think it helps to sort of have a basic understanding of how your amplifier works and what it's actually doing. Now we're going to talk about the amp and how your signal flows through it in just a second, but before we get there, we're going to start with the tube. This really is the meat and potatoes, the heartbeat, so to speak, of a tube amp. This is what's responsible for the rich, luscious sound that we all love as guitar players and what's known as distortion, natural tube distortion and harmonic distortion. Essentially, what a vacuum tube is doing is amplifying a very weak signal through the flow of electrons. And your guitar controls that flow of electrons through the very weak electrical signal that travels from the pickups out your cable and to the vacuum tube. Now that's a very basic explanation of how tubes work, and in fact we'll probably do a more in-depth video on this channel in the very near future because I love this stuff. Even though this is decades and decades old technology, we as guitar players still rely on it every day, and I think it's incredibly fascinating. So now let's talk about the basics of tube amps and how they work. At its most basic, a tube amp like this is using a combination of tubes and circuitry and transformers to take a very weak electrical signal from your guitar's pickups and create a mirrored signal inside the tubes, which travels through the amp circuitry through an output transformer to the speaker. The speaker then converts that electrical signal into a kinetic signal that your ears pick up as sound waves. Now most tube amps have 3 or 4 basic sections. Section 1 you can think of as the input stage. And if we look back here on the back of this amp, this is where the guitar signal hits its first preamp tube. This is known as the preamp section. The preamp section is responsible for taking that very weak guitar signal and using it to amplify an electrical signal through the preamp tubes and control and shape the sound of that signal before it sends it on to the next section. This is where the tone stack of the amp lives, which in this amp's case would be the 3-band EQ, the different EQ switches. That's living in the tone stack of the circuit of this particular amp. Now, once your signal flows from the preamp section and gets shaped by the tone stack, it then needs to be amplified further before it can go to the speaker. So it goes to what's called the power section. And this is where we see tubes like this. This is a 6V6 power tube. Power tubes take the slightly amplified signal from the preamp section and amplify it even more. You can think of each set of tubes taking the signal, making it louder, sending it to the next tube, which takes the signal, makes it louder, sends it to the next tube, which takes the signal and makes it louder. From the power amp section, the amplified signal then travels to the output transformer, which is responsible for taking that signal and transforming it into a type of signal that can drive the guitar speaker or multiple speakers in the cabinet. That's a very basic overview of how tube amps like this work, but it's important to understand what's going on inside the circuitry of this amp so that we can use that knowledge to help us dial in the type of sounds that we want to hear. So to demonstrate the tube amp sound, I've got my guitar plugged into the front end of this amp. This is my divided by 13 RSA 23, and I think this amp is particularly well suited to demonstrate this effect. Right now my guitar is plugged into the low input of this left channel right here. And you can see I've got the volume pointed to about 9 o'clock. That's pretty low for this amp. And if I play, you'll hear that the tone is pretty clean. There's not much saturation or breakup coming from the amp at all. Sounds okay, but it's a little anemic. It's a little one-dimensional and a little flat. So what I'm gonna do is boost the volume, and you're gonna hear a little more distortion start to come into the signal. And if I continue to push the volume on this amp, it continues to break up more and more and get even more saturated or even more distorted. Now, nothing about my setup has changed. The guitar hasn't changed. I haven't kicked on any pedals. It's just the amp. And that distortion, that breakup that you're hearing is coming from the tubes inside the amp. It's coming from the preamp tubes and the power amp tubes. And it's what's known as clipping. The tubes are working past, they're exceeding their amplification limit. And when that happens, it starts to clip the signal. Now, clipping is another word for distortion or saturation. And the type of clipping that's happening in this amp is what's known as soft clipping. As the sine wave, the sound wave, is amplified by the tube, it reaches a certain limit where the tube can no longer amplify it even more. But the input signal going into the tube is starting to exceed that limit. So the tube starts to soft clip or chop off the tops of those waves. It's not only distorting the signal, it's also adding what are called harmonics. And this addition of harmonics and distortion we find very pleasing to our ear. Now, this last setting is really distorted. It's really broken up, but it's not what I would call edge of breakup. For this particular amp, the edge of breakup sound is right about here. Now, essentially what edge of breakup is right on the edge. It's in between clean and heavily distorted. It's sort of right in the middle. And this really is a sweet spot for an amp like this. As a guitar player, I set up almost all of my amps to have an edge of breakup tone, and here is why. When it's set like this, I can control how clean or how dirty the amp is with my picking hand. If I pick harder, if I play harder on the guitar, the amp starts to break up more. It starts to clip and distort the signal more. If I back off and I play softer, the amp cleans up. Without having to change any controls on the guitar, without kicking any pedals on or off, I control how distorted the amp is. So I'm gonna start by playing really soft, and I'm gonna dig in harder, and you're gonna hear the amp start to break up more. One of the other main reasons to run an amp like this on the edge of breakup is that it still takes pedals really, really well. And it gives me a lot of options in terms of my gain staging. As I already mentioned, I can control how much gain or how much distortion is coming from the amp by how hard I pick. And if I want more gain or more distortion than I can get with my playing hand, all I have to do is kick on a simple boost. So right now I've got my guitar going into my pedal board here, and I'm going to use the Strymon Compadre, just the boost side, to hit the front end of the amp a little harder, giving me even more saturation and distortion than I could get on my own. Or if I want even more clipping and more distortion, I can kick on something like an overdrive. And one of my favorite things to do is to use fuzz. Sometimes, depending on what type of amp and fuzz you're using, if you have a lot of gain dialed into the amp and you hit it with a fuzz, it can tend to fall apart. Also, if you have an amp that's just completely clean, the fuzz might not be doing everything it can to get the best sound or the best tone, which is slightly subjective. But right here, I've got a really great octave fuzz that works incredibly well with an edge of breakup tone like this. And lastly, time-based effects like reverbs and delays. If you have your effects, like a reverb, for example, going into the front end of an amp that's heavily distorted, then those reverb trails are going to start to fall apart and distort as well, because along with your guitar signal, you're also sending the affected signal, the reverb trails, the delay repeats, into the preamp section, into the power amp section as well. If you keep the front end of the amp clean-ish, or an edge of breakup tone, you can maintain your nice, pretty reverb trails and delays just by picking a little bit lighter. Switched over to the HX Stomp XL to kind of demonstrate the same principles apply when you're using a modeling amp like a Helix or Kemper or an AxeFx or Iridium. Anything out there that's digitally modeling a tube amp should have the same principles at play. But I'm going to show you how I like to set up a digital amp, a computer, if you will, to emulate the tube version. So if you look here in HX Edit, I'm using a pretty simple setup. And by the way, if you are a Helix user, you're an HX Stomp user, a normal Helix user, I've made this preset available for download in the description box below. But essentially what I've got going on is an amp type that's similar to the RSA-23 I was playing earlier. That's a very British voiced amp. And so in the Helix, I'm using the Matchstick. And if you look, basically I've got channel 1 drive set here to about 3.5. And then I've got my channel volume in my master set pretty high. So setting the master volume and the channel volume that high will give you a little bit more headroom, so the amp will clean up a little bit better. Now that's a really sparkly, brilliant, clean tone. And if you were just listening to that on its own, you might think that that's a really clean amp. But a normally clean amp won't break up like this. And then, like I was demonstrating earlier, if you put a boost pedal in front of it, it'll get even more gain. That's an incredibly useful and very, very versatile sound that you can use to cover a lot of ground. You don't have to do a bunch of preset switching. You don't have to use different profiles. It's just one sound, and it's extremely versatile dependent on how hard you play. Now, this is the thing to understand about edge of breakup tones. You want to have a good control over your dynamics, over your picking hand. The other thing to think about is not using a compressor. If I had a compressor pedal in front of my amp or a compressor block in front of the model here, it's essentially going to eliminate the whole point of having an edge of breakup sound, because what the compressor is doing is evening out all of your picking dynamics. So it's taking that layer of expressive control away from you. Now, I'm not anti-compressor. I think they're really cool, but this is why I don't advocate guitar players using always on compression, because when you're using a sound like this, it's actually taking away more than it's adding. Plus, when the tubes are clipping, that's actually a form of compression. Harmonic distortion and overdrive coming from the amp itself is actually compressing. You may be able to tell that even though I'm picking lighter and harder, the overall volume is not actually changing that much. The only thing that's really changing is the amount of distortion or saturation coming from the amp. To demonstrate, I'll show you this. If I start off by playing a pretty simple bluesy kind of lick, really soft, and then I really dig in harder, it got dirtier and more saturated, but it didn't necessarily get louder. And the same thing happens with the real amp going through a speaker cab. It's acting as a natural form of compression. So I don't necessarily think you always need to have a compressor on in front of your signal chain. So hopefully you now have a good understanding of what edge of breakup means and what it sounds like and how to dial it in on your rig at home. If you enjoyed today's video, don't forget to subscribe and click that bell icon to be notified when I'm going live and posting new videos. And we're probably gonna make this some type of a series. I really enjoyed talking about the amps and how they work today. So there may be more in this style of video coming very soon. Don't forget to check out the tone course and the Nashville Number System course and Fretboard Fundamentals in the description box down below. If you want more information on the gear that I used in today's video, you can find some affiliate links down there as well. And don't forget to follow me on Instagram and TikTok at Rhett Shull. Thank you guys so much for watching, and remember, there is no plan B.